Hi, I'm Seamless, and today I'm going to show you how to make this sound. Whee! Alrighty, so a bunch of stuff I don't normally do. One thing was actually using the Lfo mode in the automation here to actually do typical LFO-y things, like you would do if you were mapping an LFO inside Serum or something. As it turns out, if you go to any given automation clip and just click on the LFO button, from being an automation clip, it'll become an LFO. And then it gives you various LFO parameters that you can totally automate. In this case, I'm automating the speed parameter here to give us this rate, and then speeding up a bit, and then this rate, and then that rate. And as you can see, the LFO itself updates in real time, which is a lot of fun visually, and also fun for when we do that kind of stuff. I mean, you can do that kind of stuff with regular LFOs too, but this one being able to see specifically what that looks like is kind of neat. As you see, I split them all up into their own bits here, and that's because when you change the speed of a thing like this guy here, it does it relative to where it begins, and that's quite a bit different than if it were actually beginning on like whatever beat or whatever you're trying to get a thing to do a thing on, which is also why over here you see this is slightly offset, which is what I did using the slip tool. This guy here, you can moving around, and that I did by ear because this guy landed somewhere special, and then I wanted this guy to begin somewhere specific after the fact, and did that with just moving that until it sounded like it fit. And then the curve itself is also created in here with tension and skew and that kind of business. This is like if it were a regular LFO inside something, in any of these dudes. Like actually in here is also a similar LFO setup. They give you this bit of automation here to tell you that you can shape it over time with automation, and you can actually do that too in the LFO with an automation clip. I just don't tend to do that if I'm going to be doing that, because that's like I'll just do automation. I used to do that in some really old songs because it's also fun again visually to see a lot of stuff change in real time. But it's just not as efficient as just straight up automating something in my mind. Anyway, let's talk about the actual sound. In here is this envelope controller controlling a whole bunch of stuff. The first guy is just going straight up to the X mod inside Sytrus itself. There's a lot of real specific shenanigans happening in here, so we're going to need to delve into this dude by himself. To begin with, there's two outputs happening right here. I made myself a morphing filter type here. You can see there's an LFO. Like, that's not at all what's happening here. You can see filters. Yes, that's the word. You can see filters, low pass, band pass, high pass. And the low pass is going out its own channel, and the band pass and high pass are going out its own channel. They're being kind of processed as kind of like a high and low. And then before any of this, actually, let's actually just put you back in there and then take you out here. And then here what this guy sounds like on the low end by himself. And also, there's a sine wave coming out here on the low end that's being modulated with time as well in volume. Yeah, rumbly business. And then the high frequency. So the shenanigans that are happening here, let's actually go main out because we're going to listen to this FM stuff first. I have unison engaged, right? And then there is pitch and then there is phase. But this stuff has tremendous different impact on the sound because I've also engaged unison index mapping on also pitch and also phase. This is because I'm using the ring modulation to do oscillation level volume morphing, essentially. You see this saw shape coming in down here. This guy is operating on this guy, which is this shape in here. So before we even talk about what this is doing to the FM to sound, we got to understand what these two guys are doing to each other. So unlike FM, ring modulation, which is like FM but for volume, the shape is literal. When we see this is literally like zero crossing, so this is no level, and then there's negative level, positive level, so this is saying that there's going to be level at the beginning of the oscillation, and then near the end of the oscillation, the volume will come down. So this shape happening, right? This is still meaning the same thing. This is saying this is what this is doing to the volume of number 1 here. So number 3 is doing this shenanigan to number 1. But we got to think of this shape as being changed a bit as if it were sliced by this saw wave, because that's what this guy's doing. He's modulating the volume of number 3 here, so you see this kind of tall curve here is not as tall as this curve in reality because it's being cut down by the saw wave exactly in this shape. Yeah, see that? See that? See that? Good. So, no more sign. So with this guy. So here's what number 1 sounds like without that happening to it. Here is just a crazy shape that I made by messing around with the sign shaping, and there's just shenanigans, honestly. Like the whole point of this sound was mostly that these two were going to be a mess, and then I was going to shape that mess with 3 and 4. So here's the mess, and here's like a slightly askew, almost triangle being mainly turned into saw harmonics for being skewed as such, and then all of this junk is going into filter. But before we do that, I have unison engaged, but I'm using unison in here. I have the pitch changed in the unison index mapping tab. So these are all the 8 voices that are present, all these black columns here, and the offset is just being that that's just going to be a tiny amount of offset. Even tinier is that by default this knob is over here, right, for all the various parameters, oscillators rather. And when you take this down, this is changing how wide this graph is for pitch change. So way to hell down here, this is max plus 50 cents and then minus 50 cents. So this is barely one step like for the whole range. And this is the amount that's actually being changed. It's extremely slight. And same thing with this guy. And then we're also changing the phase. The phase is also, I guess it's not being changed. That's right. This is actually a slightly faster solution to what I was trying to do originally, which was because when you unison these things, these guys, which a whole point of this is that it makes the mess sound sharp, is that they get smoothed out too because they're being unison. Well, I didn't want that to happen. I wanted the unison effect on these guys to have like the phase cancellation and whatever, but I wanted these guys to still actually be sharp. So that's why this has the internal unison going on and these don't. And then on top of that, I also did tiny amounts of phase change and pitch change. Without all that, that's what this sounds like. That's what this shape, FMing this shape sounds like. And then when we apply this to it, this is what happens to it. Now, this particular sound was not something that I was like, yes, good, this is what I wanted before I moved on. I didn't actually hear what this sounded like before I heard the effect on it. Most of the time, when you decide to go and do things like create phase cancellation, whatever, you're going to end up changing a lot of stuff. And then when you go back and listen to it as we are now, it's not really like a choice you made. It's just what happened later. Of course, the whole point of this was that this goes to the filter. Need you guys. There you go. Now, these guys, this is just a low pass, a band pass, and a high pass. And they are moving very slightly from their current positions, and the high pass is actually moving opposite direction, which is kind of neat because then there's volume change. And then these shapes are something that also got kind of curved after the fact. I initially tried to make it sound as smooth as possible, that it was just like low, mid, high, yay, cool. But with the addition of certain effects in post and that kinds of things, the weight of certain stuff had to change. And that meant that, like, for example, the bandpass needed to be more represented way over here in this part of the modulation versus the high pass. And then also decisions like the high pass and the low pass are actually quite present the whole time after you compress them, that kind of thing. So that stuff was all also decisions made in post. And also stuff like layering in the sine wave because the low end cohesion wasn't great. Yeah, and then that, so speaking of that low end, the first thing that I did was to compress the crap out of it, mostly just to see what would happen. This is not really like a necessary thing to do, and it's actually quite damaging to what I was just talking about quote unquote sub-cohesion. It had everything to do with that, just sounded awesome. And then the next dudes coming out here, oh yeah, so the filters, let's talk about these other guys, right? Because these guys have distortion on them. Along with the volume when they cut off, there's the distortion happening, and also the distortions mix. This knob here has its own page that can be linked to the modx parameter, and that's what's coming in here. And like the pre and post sound of these aren't all that different. The harmonic mess is still as it is, and the shape itself and the wave shaper is like almost folding, but this one actually kind of is folding, but it's mostly just damage. And the value of that is that all of this was still sound pretty well fine as long as we like process the low end and the high end kind of differently. And then another experiment got into play, and that is the reality of what a phaser filter is. In Maximus, wow, I like blended 11 plugins in my head just then, but in Serum, in a lot of the filter types, there's also this whole section on phaser filters. and flangers and that kind of thing. Flanging is different from phasing because phasing is a filter action, but flanging is a phase action. It's where you're phasing a thing against itself, and that's what's causing the effect. The term flange itself is actually a piece of gear on tape decks that when you press it down and it delays the speed on one of the sides of the stereo, and that causes the flanging effect because you're changing a pitch or detuning it. Why this matters is that when you do the really small delay time thing, you're phasing it. That's phasing. And when you think about like the kind of phase cancellation you get when you just detune saws together, how it kind of goes, it's moving down. That's like when the phase is constantly changing. But if you just pick a delay time and you stick it there, it's going to cause the holes in the spectrum just to stay in one spot. And that's because it's not changing phase. But you're still phasing it. And it's because you're creating essentially another signal that's happening really close to it. And then there's phase change. And that's causes that. And the cooler ones inside Serum, there's the option to have like a high pass or a low pass version of it. And you see kind of like, wow, the filters effect it can be like attenuated against the sound. Like you can actually low pass the filters effect and without low passing everything. And when you have a delay model that lets you do delay filtering, like you filter just the feedback, then that's exactly what happens. That is the literal exact same thing. So here we have this guy. This is the high pass guy. He's got a high pass on the top of him. I don't know why that EQ's there. I think it was just something to put this guy into. And then this guy is the low pass guy. He has pretty much the same setup, except that like he's focusing on the low end, and they have slightly different times. And it's because it's basically like having two phaser filters, two flanger filters, a high and a low one, and then high passing and low passing them to fit in their respective areas. And that kind of like moving against each other is causing that particular tone. And that gets to compress the hell out of it. Despite this is just the high frequency stuff, remember, so it's not even being glued together with this crazy low stuff that's also there. Woo, distortions. And then all of that is going into Vocodex. Woo! Gotta love the stuff that happens here. Okay, turn way the hell down. Yup. So, there are a lot of things that I'm doing, and I'm also modulating a lot of things. So, actually, we're here. Let's talk about the bandwidth. I'm modulating the bandwidth itself, and that's helping to attenuate like basically every bad thing about every position about the bandwidth. Because when you go really low, you get that like carnival-y like organ sounding thing when all the bands are really, really thin and you get just incredible resonance. And then there's way up top where everything is like kind of too thick and there's not a lot of high frequency presence. And so then you just modulate it. It kind of also makes a lot of noise. And this patch actually has quite a bit of noise involved in it. And I really tried to work with it this time. Most of the time, I try to get real clever and do things like modulate the release times and shit like that to try and minimize growdiness. But with just the amount of distortion and ridiculous happening with the harmonics in the beginning, there was no saving that. There was no honest cohesion to remain. So it was about making it brutal. It was about making the dirt kind of like actually exist in a tone that was cool. And that's really what I tried to get out of modulating the Vocodex. So before talking about the modulation also, let's talk about this guy, because this graph is probably the least well understood bit of it, which this lets you control the area of where the bands are. You might be thinking this is what the band gain multiplier is for, where we tell it where it can and cannot exist. And that's true for level, but that doesn't tell us where they actually are. These bands, like every one of these little bits of the graph actually represent all the specific bands. And then the graph itself, like sideways, represents the spectrum. And I mean that by like this axis over here, this is the low end, this is the high end. And then this graph is saying that, okay, cool. This is where it starts in the low end, and then this is where it ends in the high end. And then there's like a less even distribution. There's like this angle that's saying, okay, actually more of them are going to be in the high end than there are on the low end. And then we come over here and check that the hell out. This actually straight up moves the bands around. And this is a really linear graph that I've chosen to do here. It's very light touch, because you can do crazier, harder shit that will actually straight up like move the bands out of position that will ever make it sound like the carrier, modulator, sorry. But if you're doing like same carrier, same modulator, then that's not totally a problem. It's not even really, it's just a big option in terms of the sound design toolkit. But that's what this graph does. And it's handier, in my opinion, than actually trying to just carve it out of here with the usual stack, especially because the bands are going to be there. You can just have less bands if that would be an issue. But in the desires, so that like this, the high end is left room here, so that the high end can be filled in with the bleed through here. So to the low end, the original low end is always going to be better than whatever Vocodex does with it most of the time, and that's just because like the frequencies are too big for the cuts not to have pretty bad effect on them. And the cuts and the bands, how many bands there are. Anyway, I'm also modulating themselves, the modulator and the carrier pass through. And honestly, I should have been doing this the whole time. This isn't the first time I've done it, but this is the first time that I've just sat and thought, like, damn, this really is just like the solution to every issue. Because usually they have to blend this stuff. We're trying to make this all sound like it's all part of the same sound. And to do that, you bleed all this stuff in there. But when there's motion like this, when especially a solid repeating LFO style motion, and the things don't all move with it together, it doesn't sound together. And you just move it together. Oh my god, it's together. Oh. Yeah, and that's like a majority of these links here. This is basically the pitch guy, bandwidth guy, and then these two dudes. So pitch dude is a parameter that modulating too, and he's going down, and he's also honestly not just doing a lot. But let's talk about what the pitch does. This basically acts as if you had changed the pitch of the modulator. And so what it does is it moves whatever like presence you had up or down the spectrum. Unlike the band distribution window, which actually straight up moves the bands, this just moves where the bands are detecting stuff. So the other bands will start to play what was once in a particular area in the spectrum. And that makes it sound like you have a lower pitched modulators, as if you had lowered the pitch of something. You could also just lower the pitch of something. If you like pre-pitched a person's voice to be a really low formant sound, that would actually have the same exact effect as if you had turned it down here. Only you can modulate this. And I guess you can modulate pitch ahead of time too, but I'm just saying that's what it's for. That's the effect. So I'm also messing with the release times. So this knob up here, I've turned down minimum times, which means, so this is like, it calls this minimum safe times, and it means like all that stuff I've always been talking about how fast you modulate something. If you modulate it faster than oscillation, then it creates extra harmonics, and these filters can move faster than the area of spectrum is, like in straight up hertz and speed values, and that will just create distortion. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad, and for the release times, there's areas of the spectrum that, like, again, that kind of ringy carnival-y sound that sound good and bad. And it really is kind of like there's the lower you go, and then there's like this weird the mid section where most of the formant stuff lives that you kind of want, the window of the bands to still do a thing. And then the higher frequencies where if there's too much activity, you get that kind of watery lo-fi feel. So that's why it's like steadily increasing over the higher frequencies. And then also in the lowest frequencies, just little very off. And that's because for whatever activity that band was going to do, I wanted it to go away the second it was done. And the activity was also sparse enough because of the distribution and whatnot. That's again, I did most of this by ear, most moving it around. And I am just describing the reality of why it happened to work. Yep. All right. That's all those guys, right? Yep. So this dude. And now there is some spectral stuff to do. So I put it through a delay. Woof. And that was loud. And it's a little bit difficult to perceive because this is the curve. Not the same as a normal looking kind of 0 to 100 modulation, where it's kind of like, sure, there might be a curve or whatever, but it's supposed to be more the farther up you go. And this is just plugging up a hole. Because here's what it sounds like without it. And then also without the reverb, that's part of it. This is important because actually, while we're at it, I'm gonna have to play the whole thing with the compression, because this specific curve being here at that height was a result of it being compressed hard enough. But the idea being is that, like, I wanted air, I wanted texture, but again, with all like the standing, I don't really like it when the tails are too super obvious. So then the obvious odd solution is just to modulate it with it. But if you modulate it just straight up and down, it really just kind of still sounds like it's verbed. So doing it this way gets you it gets you the texture, and it gets you in the modulation where it sounds good and nowhere else. And that's really why I like this extremely specific modulation curve like tech that we can do with envelope controllers. And like it's not really that well. Honestly, I can't think of like plugins that do this as well. But there's like X mod control with this kind of extreme precision inside the whole modulation is what nets us really well crafted sounds, because we can fit this stuff into just wherever they need to be. And this guy is actually a much lower tuned one. He's basically tuned to the root, but because of how tight the modulation is, it is not super important that it be like keyboard track or anything like that. And this guy's fairly big. There's actually a fairly large reverb sound that wouldn't have flown very well if it were actually on the whole time. This is why it works, because we're controlling it. And it's really, really special EQ, where I tried very hard not to mess with anything on the low end because all of that nice thump we're hearing is there. And if I had moved it at all, it would be bad. And then lots of things that had to be compensated for each other because just everything, the phases, and then compressed a lot. So when you're doing these like really 0 to 100 LFO modulations that actually go down to pretty well quiet at the bottom, when you compress them again, you got to be super cognizant of how hard you're pushing up that whole modulation, because you could change the rhythm in a way that might actually negatively impact it. Because the rhythm is in here, it's in the shape, and if you change that shape, you change the rhythm. So some things do get changed, and some things are supposed to like that feels good because we have changed them. And then other stuff like I had to be a little more careful with. So that's why these like lines are actually like they look like they care more than my usual kind of make them all big kind of approach. And then also there's compression going on the top, but like light. I have really big release times going on, which means that it's not like super loudness inducing. And then also some of them are even like less loud than they would be otherwise. And that's just because I couldn't push it too much harder after having done this. So this is mostly about it, just keeping it in control and consistent. And there's this. That is this sound. This will be available to download in the description of this video. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day. Yeah.